So thanks again for having me here, and apologies for the challenges right at the beginning. I think this is a perfect example of some of the things we're dealing with in this new world we're in, where everything is completely remote, and but I am excited to see that people are making the best of it. So as she mentioned, I'm a general manager with TechStars. So what we do is TechStars is an organization that makes investments in startups around the world, and we do it both through an investment division of the organization, as well as through our mentorship-driven accelerators. So I have the privilege of being able to work with founders around the world via our accelerators. And then I've also developed a podcast in the last year focused on telling more stories of what's possible for women in the workforce, navigating families and career, and most recently published a book called Yes, You Can Do This, How Women Startups Scale Up and Build the Life They Want. And it's really designed to be part manifesto to encourage women to consider entrepreneurship, not just as a way to change their personal circumstances or to solve a particular problem that they're having, but to really think at scale about how businesses can actually transform our world and the world of work. So do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So one of the things you probably all are familiar with is the concept of lean in, which it's really been a book of the last few years that has resonated with so many of us, myself included. I was actually featured on the Lean In website in 2013 as a profile on taking risks. And the premise of the book is really to encourage women to double down on their careers, to really think through what's possible, and to keep driving forward and to make progress in the world of work. And one thing that I noticed came up in the last about year and a half is an ongoing sort of backlash to the concept. And in a way that I don't think any of the people in the conversation necessarily intended it. So about a year ago, former First Lady Michelle Obama was on a book tour, and she happened to say, hey, lean in doesn't work all the time. Well, instead of going into a bigger conversation of what do you mean by that, let's talk about what we all mean by leaning in or leaning out, or what this concept is even like. It really just took off in the media with a firestorm, basically to say, that's it, people are saying it, you can't lean in. And so I really started to take a step back and think, one, why is this the conversation? Is this just a false dichotomy that's being presented as women's choice? And what can we really do about it? So if you could take onto the next slide really quick. So I wanted to, exactly right there is fine. I wanted to take a start by taking a step back and thinking about, if you look at these folks in front of us right now, you might recognize some of their faces. I was trying to think about, well, how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where we're still having these conversations about women in leadership, about the world of work and what it all means? And, who are we interacting with and looking to now, and what were their experiences like? So this image right here in front of you actually has some people you may have seen in the news quite a bit lately. That's Bernie Sanders, that's Joe Biden down at the bottom, Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump, all in their early parts of their careers, in their early 20s in the 1970s. And I started looking at these folks and thinking, okay, these are actually examples of question. I think without question, we could all say in our society, they fit the bill of being incredibly ambitious folks, right? They're all looking to be president of the United States at some point. And yet the experiences that they had as they were highly educated, stepping into the workforce, stepping into their careers, were very different. And the opportunities that they had were different. So if you could go on to the next slide really quick. Because basically what was different was until 1974, and you could go on to the next slide, sorry, it's gonna be a little rapid fire on the slides here, women could not get credit without a male cosigner. And I think this is really important to think about, because what this really meant was, not only could you not start a business without a male cosigner, but there was something deep in our society that was telling women, we don't trust you with money, right? That was something that each of these leaders had kind of ingrained into them at a young age, whether they actually accepted it or not. It was something that they were surrounded with. If you could go on to the next slide. And in 1978, there was another big milestone. If you could go on to the next slide, please. Because in 1978, none of these women would have been able to work without fear of discrimination for pregnancy. And it's easy to think that we're past all of these things right now, but when you think about the fact that people were stepping into careers, and these are, my mother's age, right? Folks who had this ingrained into them that they may not be trusted with money, they would need a male cosigner by law, and they may be discriminated against by law just for what is actually a pretty natural phenomenon. So if you could go on to the next slide. Just one more point to consider, 85% of women do become mothers. And I think it's something, especially as we are now in this new world where we all are working at home and trying to figure things out with childcare options and whatnot being challenged at the moment. Thinking about the fact that 85% of women have been in someone else's shoes at some point and can imagine what this would be like. So if you could go on to the next slide. And then just one more point on history here before we get into some things that I hope you guys were thinking about for today and entrepreneurship and leadership is, we look at, 1920, obviously, if you go on to the next slide. Big point. We know that 1920 was the year that women could vote. But again, going back to this idea of what are some of the ingrained beliefs and understandings that people were carrying with them, none of those same people that I showed on that slide at the beginning, all of them had most likely a grandmother who could not vote at some point in her life. And so think about the messages and the stories that must have been told to make that okay, and so I like to think about what were the things that we accepted as the norm then, and what are we accepting as the norm now that maybe we shouldn't be. If you go on to the next slide, please. So yeah, we can stop here for a sec. So the question is, why does any of this matter, right? And this is the point. I think it's important to consider that we are conditioned in ways we may not even be acknowledging, and it's important to try to break that down. And that's why we're still, playing catch up in today's society. If you go on to the next slide. So when we think about the fact that right now we still are in a position where of Fortune 500 companies, only 5%, I think it might have grown to 6% in the last year, but it's about 5%, Fortune 500 companies have a female CEO. And the next slide, please. And only 17%, though I think since I put this slide together, it's now 20%, so that's getting a little better, but it's still a very small number of women who hold corporate board seats. The next slide, please. And so when we think about that and realize like we're potentially walking around with a lot of unconscious biases that that have been ingrained into us, and we have very few women who are in actual leadership positions in large organizations right now. But if we think about the fact that if you are in a leadership position, if you can take that step into that role, that world, you get to be part of the group that makes the rules. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So the other factor here, going back to the idea that only 85% of women, or rather 85% of women do become mothers, all companies right now, we're still at 17% that actually offer paid maternity leave. The next slide, please. And we have no options or that are easy to understand from birth to age 5. Next slide, please. And I think the big factor, and we're probably all starting to get a real better sense of this now in this new world of working from home, is that the reality is the workday just does not align with the school day. And to put that in perspective, if you think about it right now, the typical day is still 9 to 5, which was really designed after, how factories were set up, how traditional offices were set up when you absolutely had to go into a building at a certain time. And you figure in you've got a commute time of plus or minus an hour on the other side. But the school days are at best 8 to 3, right? And then there's aftercare options or whatnot. But we really have, if we're thinking about the whole person, and certainly as more men start to enter and take on some caregiving responsibilities, I think we'll hear even more people talking about this. But we still are at this point in time where the world of work does not assume that people have a whole self and that they have a family and they have other things going on. So if you go to the next slide, please. The other thing I like to think about and make sure other people are thinking about is that in addition to these constraints we have in logistics and the workday, and how we're thinking about where our roles as mothers or women fit into this, when a job has been performed by a man, it does typically pay more. And I know we have a huge push right now to talk about women in STEM and how do we get more women into STEM. But I'd like to point out, if you go to the next slide, that the first programmers were actually women. In the 1940s, when the first computers were introduced, it was women who were actually the programmers of them. And at that point in time, they paid less. It was described as a job that would be well suited to women because it was similar to knitting and required a tedious mindset. And there were certain things that characterized it as quote unquote feminine. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, it became more apparent that software was critical, and men started to jump into it. And of course, it was rebranded, and now here we are trying to figure out how to get women back into it. But it's important to remember that they were always there. Likewise, the first people, just going back to this idea, the first people to deliver babies were women. But when it became systemized and something that men were stepping into as OBGYNs, it started to pay more. So let's think about the work that is still labeled as traditionally women, something women are more likely to do, and think about what that could be like if more men stepped into it as well. If you go to the next slide. So, if we think about what would the world look like if, teachers and caregivers, if more of them were men, would we start to increase pay for that? What would that really start to look like? And as we're all in this world right now where we're balancing so many different things, I think people can start to think about how valuable those resources are, and maybe where are we paying for them? This slide here is something that I've been intrigued by because I think there's something to be said for holding on to imagery and how that impacts our sense of self and what we're capable of. If you go on Google right now into images and you simply search CEO, Google pulls up images like this of men, and so when we think about a CEO, we are still only seeing those as the image, and that's where our understanding of what's possible becomes limited. If you go to the next slide, please. We're starting to see a difference. It's kind of silly, some of the images that come up if you search doctor, but you can see that as more women have entered the space and we see more images of women in that space, it becomes a heck of a lot easier to imagine yourself there. So if you go to the next slide, please. I know we're not quite open to Q&A yet, but if you're seeing this picture at all, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but this is actually, it's kind of a silly picture, right? It's the cast of a late 90s TV show called Ally McBeal. And I put this up here because up until this time period, there were actually far fewer women who were applying to law school. Now, certainly no one, I would imagine, would become a lawyer because of Ally McBeal or some silly TV show. But there is a correlation to having seen someone who looks like you in a certain role. Believe it or not, around this time frame, applications to law schools greatly increased for women. So there's something to be said for simply creating a world where we see more people that we want, if we want to have more people in certain positions, we need to create more images of those people in those positions so that people can hold on to that as something that's possible. If you go to the next slide, please. So again, we just need to see some more people who look like us. And if you go to the next slide, please. Sorry, it's a little challenging with the remote clicking. But one of the things, and we can stop here for a sec, the other thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about making progress in the world of work, and I know there's going to be a lot of conversations happening in this cafe over time, is there is research, as you all know or might know, that for example, in the investment world, women are more likely to get very different questions than men are. And it's important for us, I think, to acknowledge that and then to think through how we can both respond and change that. Oh, we're getting questions. I think we just lost the screen for a sec. So if you, so just to give you some quick examples, there are studies out there that show that women are more likely to get questions about the risk associated with the project or plan that they're working on, whereas men are more likely to get questions about the opportunity that they're working towards and building towards and the size of it. So it's challenging because, of course, and if you stop here for a second, sorry, if you are going to raise capital, or you're going to try to tell your story of what you're trying to do, if you end up talking about risk, you actually start to talk about all the things you don't want to talk about. And so one of the things we try to talk to founders about is, if you are to get questions about what could go wrong, take that and flip it into how you get to opportunity. So acknowledge the question, but then move on and talk about where you're going and how big and how exciting that is. And studies show that when you can flip the answer into something bigger and to redirect the conversation, you're more likely to have a better outcome. But I think it's important for all of us to understand why not only are the questions given, but why are we answering the questions? And there's studies that show that, with very young women, even in elementary school aged, women are more likely to be conditioned that they're rewarded for compliant behavior. And boys are not conditioned this way. So girls are more rewarded for giving the right answer, coming in on time, staying in their seat. Boys are actually ignored for all of that behavior, and instead are given an awful lot of attention for minor misbehavior. And what this leads to as adults is, the studies would show, women are more likely to answer the question even when it doesn't serve them, but they're getting the right answer. So that question about risk. Whereas men are more likely to ignore the questions because they're used to ignoring things and being told they're misbehaving. And so then they move on to where they want to go and where they want to take folks. So that's why I encourage people, if you're thinking about how to go on to the next step in your career, how to think about what's possible, I encourage everyone to think about leaning in by starting up. Because it's a way to not only get past some of the limitations that are there in the workforce in terms of stepping into leadership roles, because the minute you start your own company, you're in a leadership role. But it's also a way for you to think about how to change the rules for everyone else and some of these constraints we have and some of these mindsets we have that we're all trying to react to. If you could go on to the next slide. And remember, when you're in charge, you can make the rules. If you go on to the next slide. And just, also trying to keep in mind that, some of the things that startups have brought us, and sorry, I know you're flipping through, but just real quickly, if you think about, it wasn't that long ago that, social media was introduced, that some of the services that we take for granted now, like Uber and Lyft, disrupted the taxi industry, and so on and so on, better underwear with things like Spanx, right? And if you go on to the next slide, please. They've, startups have also normalized a lot of things that maybe we hadn't thought, we don't give a lot of thought to right now, because we kind of take them for granted, in terms of casual dress and collaborative workspaces and bringing pets to work. So when you think about a startup, I challenge you to think about, what else could you bring to bear in a new business? What else could you think about that maybe folks are not thinking about right now, because we're just accepting the world as it is? The next one. And just a few more things on the idea that these leaders are, it's such a small group of women in the Fortune 500 right now. But if you go to the next slide, I think it's important to understand that this isn't just lip service to looking to build more diversity into teams. The research clearly demonstrates that corporations and groups that have diverse leadership actually outperform their competitors. And we also know that in the next 10 years, 40% of these companies are not going to be on that Fortune 500 list. So, and with everything happening in the world right now, I don't think there could be a better time to rethink what's possible and think about what you might disrupt. So this would be a question I have for all of you, which I'm excited to hear your thoughts on and challenge you on today. But if you go to the next slide, please. Just two more thoughts here. We spend a lot of time thinking about the startup guys in the garage and all of the things and the big companies we know that came out of those types of spaces. But here we are in a new world where we're in our homes and we're trying to make things work. So if you go to the next slide. I would challenge you to think about what you could do in your living room, because it's not too far off. And I think that we have a pretty big opportunity ahead of us to rethink what's possible. So yeah, this is really a call to rethink not only the businesses you might disrupt, and what you might build next, but also the way in which we work and what's possible there. So these are just some changing questions for you. And thank you. I know this was a little bit awkward with the dual sync on the slides, but really excited to maybe take some questions from you guys at this point.
So let me exit the screen sharing right now and see if we have any questions in the chat. So we see some greetings from all over the place, New York and New Jersey. Let me see. We have a lot of thank yous for the opportunity. And we have one message from Diana. General advice for general female solo founders who are starting MVP phase. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, depending on where you are in your journey, if you're just starting to think about what you're about to build, definitely start by thinking about what problem you're solving. And happy to also set up one-on-one times with folks for office hours to work through some things as well. But definitely doing that initial analysis, I think, is key. One of the things we try to talk to folks about is really thinking about your vision of where do you want this, where is the biggest place that you could imagine whatever your service or product or offering is, where's the biggest place you could take it. If you had all the funding you needed, if you had all the people you needed, where could you go? And then walk yourself back to today and what you need to do to get there. Sometimes people think incrementally in terms of, it's just me today. How do I go from here to this next step or this next thing? And I challenge you to kind of reverse that thinking and think, okay, in 5 years, I'm going to have a team of X number of people and we're going to have changed the world with this type of solution. These are all the things I would have needed in order to get to that place.
More questions. It looks like Karen would like to know, to hear more of your thoughts on entrepreneurship. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Well, yeah, I guess what specifically, any specific questions on entrepreneurship? I mean, I think there are some other things I didn't share is that there's the goal of creating your own business. But remember, there's also the goal of finding other people who are also trying to create things and, finding synergies there and finding opportunities to work with others. And sometimes it might look like you starting your own endeavor. And sometimes it might look like you joining someone else's. And sometimes you can apply an entrepreneurial mindset within a large organization. And that's going to become a more and more important skill over time as Fortune 500 companies continue to be, disrupted and challenged.
Oh, we're starting to get more questions.
Okay.
So Rebecca is asking, can I see your sources for the stats on pay discrepancy between men and women? If you could speak to where that information is coming from, it looks like we have some more deep interest into that. I have several people in my life who don't believe me when I try to present issues like that.
Yes, yeah, I have, this is based off a number of different sources that are referenced in my book. What I'll do after this call is I'm not sure exactly how I can get this to everyone, but I'll get it to the organizers here and they can get it to you. I'll share a full list of sources that I've used for research over time.
Wonderful. This is wonderful. Thank you. Claire is asking, other early stage venture firms or incubators that are known to be particularly friendly towards female founders. Could you share a couple with us, or how to identify?
There are actually more and more coming up. So, I mean, first of all, I'm obviously with TechStars, and we have made a commitment to, be inclusive and find and support more female entrepreneurs. So that's something we just do naturally inside of TechStars. But there's a number of other organizations, and I'm not going to be able to hit them all on this, but I can send a list after. But some like Backstage Capital, Valor, there's Harlem Capital just announced, they came out earlier last year to talk about their relationship with TechStars as well. So there's a long list I'm happy to share that I'm not going to be able to hit all of them on this call, but there's a good number that I'm happy to offer up.
Kristen is asking, tell us the good news. What are the areas in which female entrepreneurs are excelling right now?
Well, I think the good news is that we're the fact that we're even having conversations like this, right? I think we're getting to the point where I mean, there's been some really great stories in the last year, like you saw ClassPass and others where there's been some big successes. There's organizations like All Raise. That's a group here in Boston that's focused on trying to make an impact and change what's possible for, increase the number of female investors as well. So I think the good news is that we're seeing a lot of people rallying right now to really make investments in this space. And we're seeing, some of the stories coming out of, like in my program last year, we invested in 10 companies focused on advances in manufacturing and sustainable tech, and 50% of our group of 10 had female CEOs or co-founders. So I thought that was a big win. We were actually representing the population. So,
This is indeed good news.
yeah.
Our next question is coming from Chandra. Can you share some tips about building male allies?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize like we're all in this together. And I had an opportunity to meet with some MBA students at Yale, and that was one of the things that encouraged me the most. Is even when we were all talking about some of the challenges in unconscious bias in investor meetings, I heard firsthand men wanting to be part of the solution. I really think this comes back to really just getting the education and information out there. And once people acknowledge it as real, people will start to make change. But some of the throughout my career, I've worked with men, and I think I acknowledge that some of the folks who've been most generous with their time have been men. So I think it's hopefully we're going to see some big positive moves forward in the next year or so.
Thank you. So next question from Diana. What tech resources are available from TechStars for early stage founders? I know my industry, I know the problem, and I have a viable opportunity I can frame, but I am not tech savvy. Advice for starting to learn?
Sure. So, in terms of learning the tech or learning just where to take your company next. So from a TechStars perspective, we have a number of we have about 50 accelerators around the world, some with vertical focuses like advanced manufacturing or fintech or insurtech, and others that are subject matter agnostic. Like there's a Boston program right here. There's a New York City program where they're really looking at a variety of different companies and problems that they're solving. In terms of where to get started, we do have an entrepreneurial toolkit on our site that's free that gives you some really great resources on everything from thinking about your pitch deck to how to basically take those first steps. So happy to share more details on that after this call with attendees as well. And then in terms of finding or working on the tech component, there's a lot of resources out there on learning technology yourself, obviously, and learning how to code or what those things are. But if you're looking for people who already know those things, I'd recommend, especially in a place like Boston, going to local developer meetups, going to different groups where you can just network and connect with folks and see. Because remember, it's not just finding someone. If you're not technical, it's not just about finding someone who's technical. It's about finding someone you really want to work with too.
Thank you. Lindsay's here in chat saying, thank you so much for this discussion. With regard to the topic of traditionally gendered roles, how do we move the needle in both directions, like breaking down the stigmas of gendered work instead of just focusing on bringing girls into STEM? Are there?
I hope so. This is something I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I think there's I would love to see more men eventually, be incentivized to step into roles of childcare or early childhood education. Because I think while we're all stressed right now with some of the things going on in the world, and we're kind of all trapped inside, obviously, I'm hoping that those who have young kids in particular are really seeing, firsthand, just obviously how how much we know that we value the importance of like an early childhood experience, but I do think that it's something, as we see more people trying to step into that field, we'll see that, it's something that needs to be paid for. But, we need to put our money where our mouth is, I guess, is the way to think of it.
Karen is asking, could you give an example or a case study of entrepreneurship that was successful?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a ton of different examples of actually at TechStars, we work with different corporate partners and help those corporate partners by connect with the startup ecosystem, do POCs with companies, and so it's a great win-win both for the founders and for the corporation. And so we've seen startups engage with the large organizations and develop some proof of concepts. In our program in 2008, we had a company called Quambio that was able to identify a new use case inside of Stanley Black & Decker. But in terms of entrepreneurial, they have a great example they've given on they have 7 core business units, and they set up an incremental innovation team for each. And then they have a disruptive innovation team out on the West Coast. And the idea with the incremental innovation teams is to encourage people of, what could we build onto this, or what could be next? And they had some really interesting examples this year of, or last year rather, of building out a new battery technology that became a huge market leader in a relatively short period of time. And that's a testament to how they thought about their innovation program internally and encouraged people to be more entrepreneurial inside the company. So it's really this balancing act of, figuring out from an innovation standpoint, how do you encourage your employees to be entrepreneurial while maintaining operational efficiency and, stabilizing the business while it's growing. And then, also connecting to what's disruptive and potentially on the edge of your market.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. So Pardis is asking, do you think investments will slow down in this environment? What can service providers to startups do to continue to grow their business in these unknown times?
Yeah, we actually just had some of the great leaders from like David Cohen and others from TechStars put together some AMAs specifically on this topic that I can also share out after this call that'll give a little more guidance on that. But, obviously these are very interesting times, I would say the least. And so, obviously this is the time to be, really mindful of your cash flow and thinking about how you're continuing to motivate employees if you have them and get on to the next phase. One thing I'm excited about, with TechStars, we haven't stopped. We're still investing in companies right now. And many of the, investors throughout our network are still doing that. So certainly it looks like a little bit of a bumpy path ahead given the economy we're in, but it's encouraging to know that, at TechStars, we're continuing. We've got applications open right now all around the world and continuing to write checks for companies that come into TechStars.
Thank you. Another one from Jackie. Do you have advice for rebuilding one's career and public image following a difficult loss?
I don't, without knowing, more about that, maybe that's when we could take offline to, depending on what the loss was, to be more sensitive to the question. I don't want to guess at what that was like. But thinking generally, I think it's really important to stay positive and to, we do talk a lot about freedom to fail. And I think the reality is everyone you see has had a failure at some point. Everyone has had something that's been difficult or not gone the way that they wanted it to go. And, tomorrow's always a fresh start. So don't, again, I'm happy to take that one offline depending on what the loss was, but there's always a fresh way of looking at things.
So we are kind of running out of time. So we'll need to wrap up this session, but thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed the keynote address, and Claudia, thank you so much for volunteering your time today. We'd really love to get your feedback, so please take the survey that I will post in the chat in the second. It's actually helping us a lot to build our programming to serve you better. If you would like to host a session of your own, I am going to post a link into the chat so you can submit your proposal, and we'll be happy to review it and have you at the Venture Cafe during one of our virtual events. Our next session is called How I Solved It, and it is a female entrepreneur round robin / panel. It's going to start at 5, and Bobby Carlton will be moderating. So I hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you. Thank you so much.
you.
Have a wonderful rest of your night. Hope you stay. Bye.